Part 4, Social Factors of Altruism and Egoism. Chapter 9, What Must Be Changed in All Social Institutions and Why. Molding Power of Organized Groups and Institutions. A newborn biological organism is molded into a human personality not only by incessant cultural forces, but no less effectively by the ceaseless actions and reactions of other human beings organized into the social institutions amidst which one is born and lives. Being concrete and tangible, human beings and their actions mold our minds and conduct from the moment of birth to death. Moreover, they influence our destiny even before our birth. The prohibition of marriage between those belonging to different races, castes, and strata, or legalized infanticide in the case of a certain class of babies, inhibits the procreation of one kind of children and facilitates the multiplication of another kind. Similar results are attained through the regulation of abortion and contraceptive methods, and through the legal control of sexual life, prescribing under what conditions sex relations are permitted or prohibited. Likewise, the totality of organized groups or institutions controls our destiny even after our death. They determine whether our names shall suffer oblivion or shall survive, as famous or infamous. From the cradle to the grave, we breathe the atmosphere of organized groups, and the incessant impact of actions and reactions shapes our body, mind, personality, and conduct. If this complex of social institutions is saturated with the poisons of egoism, we tend to become egoistic. If it is permeated with invigorating altruism, we are molded along altruistic lines. Let us glance at the entire constellation of our social institutions from this standpoint. Do they breed predominantly altruistic or egoistic persons? Can we abolish at least the gravest forms of intergroup and interpersonal conflict without changing the nature of our institutions? If a change is needed, what parts are to be abolished or modified? 2. 3 conflict-breeding properties of our institutions. Pronounced social differentiation and stratification, the competition of egoistic men and groups with other men and groups, and the contractual and compulsory fibers of which the network of our institutional relationships is composed. Such are 3 fundamental traits of all our institutions. These forces generate primarily egoism and conflicts. A. Overdeveloped social differentiation and stratification. Within a given city, there are thousands of different groups, family, race, sex, and age groups, various nationality, political, economic, occupational, artistic, ethical, religious, educational, scientific, philosophical, philanthropic, recreational, and other groups, cliques, factions, sects, or parties. Within the confines of a state, the number of such groups and strata are still greater, and taking humanity as a whole, their number is to be counted by millions. As a result of this vast differentiation and stratification, each of us belongs not to one group or society, but to many. If the values and norms of conflict of all these groups and strata were mutually harmonious and reconcilable, these groups would be solidary with one another. Their relationships would be peaceful, and their members would be impelled to practice altruism. The norms of conduct would be rooted deeply in their members, effectively controlling their actions and relationships from within. Under these conditions, social differentiation of mankind into different groups and strata would generate altruistic rather than egoistic forces. Unfortunately, we have seen that the actual situation is quite otherwise. Through the excessive relativizing of all values and norms in our sensate culture, these are very different, indeed often contradictory, in different groups and strata. The values and norms of conduct of a given family, race, creed, state, or occupational group are freely irreconcilable with those of other groups of the same category. What one group affirms, another denies. The thou shalt of one stratum is countered by the thou shalt not of another stratum. The values and norms of the privileged white group in the southern states clash with those of organized Negro groups, as do those of association of manufacturers with those of labor unions, those of Catholics with those of atheists, those of communists with those of the advocates of free enterprise, and so on. The values and norms of the family often clash with those of the state. those of the state with those of religion, and those of religion with those of occupational groups, and so forth. During the Second World War and other wars, the Christian religion recommended loving the enemy, yet the state demanded wholesale slaughter of the foe. Special occupational interests dictated labor strikes, but the state required uninterrupted work as a patriotic duty. The family desired to keep its breadwinner, but the state drafted him for military service. Objectively considered, the interests and values of almost any of the existing groups irreconcilably clash with those of other groups. And such a clash is not merely prejudice and superstition. It is an objective irreconcilability of the respective values and norms of Bilbos and Negro leaders, of Jews and anti-Semites, of communists and Catholics, of conscientious objectors and glorifiers of war, and the like. As such, it cannot be eliminated merely by debunking it as, quote, prejudice and superstition. Here's a footnote here. This is the reason for the impotency of all the otherwise commendable propaganda against racial and religious tensions. In spite of a flood of such propaganda during the last few decades, neither racial nor religious tensions have decreased. In fact, they have sharply increased. Thus, our overdeveloped differentiation and stratification into a multitude of groups and strata with their contradictory values and norms inevitably generates incessant inter-individual and inter-group conflict. It leads to the mental, moral, and social disorganization of persons embedded in such a matrix of groups. Being a member of many conflicting groups and strata, an individual receives from them opposing commands, norms, and values. He is placed in the position of a ball pushed and pulled in opposite directions. His family imbues him with values and often demands from him actions irreconcilable with those inculcated or demanded by his state citizenship. These in turn frequently conflict with the values and demands of his occupational, economic, or religious affiliations. As a result of this incessant pressure, he has little chance to develop an integrated self with a single harmonious set of values and norms of conduct. His soul becomes parceled and divided into many mutually contradictory selves. He becomes a rudderless boat, a house divided against itself. His situation may be summed up as follows. Amidst the jungle of contradictory norms and values, an individual lacks a consistent set of standards. His personality thus remains unintegrated. He is the victim of endless conflicts, worries, and unhappiness, which render him an irritable psychoneurotic whose irreconcilable selves incessantly war with one another and other persons and groups, with God, and the world at large. Here's a long footnote here I'll read. The real cause of most contemporary psychoneuroses and mental illnesses is not the fantastic Freudian repression by the superego of man's libido and destructive instincts, but rather the disparity of the pressures, values, norms, and demands of the multitude of groups to which he belongs. They give him no chance to be at peace with himself, with others, and with the world at large. Growing differentiation and stratification is the cause of the increase of psychoneuroses during the last few decades. Among other evidence pointing to this conclusion is the fact that in spite of an enormous multiplication of psychoanalysts and psychiatrists during these decades, mental functional disorders have increased rather than diminished. This means that the diagnosis and treatment of the factors of psychoneuroses have been faulty. In the case of physical maladies, such as infectious diseases, where the diagnosis and treatment have been accurate, an expansion of medical and sanitary services has markedly reduced such sicknesses. This is not the case with psychoneuroses. End footnote. Under these circumstances, he cannot develop a sense of true altruism, or consistently obey the commands of Christianity, or any other moral norms. These inner conflicts are responsible for unhappiness, deterioration of one's physical health, growing cynicism, outbursts of rage, violence, and destructive tendencies, criminality, and even suicide. If one is subjected from birth to mutually contradictory norms of conduct, one group teaching that property or the marriage vow is sacred, another group declaring that possession of property is theft and that marriage vow is a bourgeois hypocrisy, he can scarcely believe that any value is sacred or any norm is binding. The slightest biological or other stimulus is sufficient to induce him to violate his norms and standards. Such violations multiply, leading to ever-growing interpersonal and intergroup conflicts. Brute force and fraud raise their ugly heads as the supreme arbiters. Individuals placed in this situation are bound progressively to transgress even their contractual obligations and loyalties. Like an investor who puts his money in too many banks, an individual attached to a multitude of contradictory groups exhibits only scant loyalty to any and is unconditionally loyal to none. His, quote, freely accepted obligation, end quote, becomes in his eyes superfluous. He unhesitatingly repudiates it at the first temptation, the more so since if he attempts to be loyal to the values and norms of one group, such a loyalty means disloyalty to other groups with opposite sets of standards. So long as this situation persists, there is no hope of avoiding its disastrous consequences. Hence arises the necessity of modifying this breeder of egoism, conflict, unhappiness, and mental disease. The first remedy consists in canceling one's membership in the less important organizations with mutually conflicting norms. If one believes that the values of Group B are less significant than those of A, he can relieve his situation by dropping his affiliation with Group B. If he does the same with regard to all his irreconcilable groups, and finally remains a member of only those organizations whose standards and norms are harmonious, he frees himself from conflicting values and norms, from inner conflicts and worries, from egoism, cynicism, and disintegration, from psychoneuroses, and the like. Controlled by the harmoniously directed forces of mutually concordant groups, he is like a ball pushed by many forces in the same direction. He regains his inner integrity, his peace of mind, his sense of a clear conscience, his determination and willpower. His duties are regarded as sacred and are gladly fulfilled. His conduct is both consistent and resolute. And he has another long footnote. It is precisely this operation of freeing an individual from his connections with mutually contradictory groups, values, norms, and standards that lies at the basis of the reorientation, reintegration, transference, and sublimation of his standards and norms, whereby he is relieved of his functional mental disorders, psychoneuroses, confusion, and disintegration. Success in the treatment of these mental orders is due mainly to his therapeutic operation, and not to the alleged liberation of the libido or death instincts from the repression of the superego, or to a mysterious sublimation of these instincts in conformity with the demands of the superego. As we shall see, chapters 12 to 15, the Freudian and other psychoanalytic theories are fantastic. When psychoanalysts do not disorganize, but actually help their patients, they do this contrary to their own theories. Unfortunately, the prescribed remedy is limited in its application. An individual cannot terminate his membership in many groups. Thus, his citizenship in the state group or membership in the family group cannot be terminated as a rule by his own decision. Likewise, his occupational or economic position cannot often be changed through his own volition. It is hardly possible for most of us freely to arrange our affiliations with all the groups and strata to which we belong. Hence the necessity for a more radical modification of our group structure. This consists in such a rearrangement of groups and strata that their antagonism is eliminated, that they do not impose mutually contradictory commands upon the individual and impel him to conflicting action. The groups and strata may be diverse, but so long as their basic values and norms are not contradictory, most of their conflicts are eliminated and the individual is freed from internal conflicts, attaining unity in diversity. We cannot eliminate the division of functions among groups, nor their diversity, but we can abolish most of their antagonistic values and standards. This can be done when all groups and strata subordinate their values and standards to a set of universal values and of concordant norms of conduct. The essence of such values and norms for interpersonal and intergroup relationships has been sublimely formulated in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Golden Rule, and in similar injunctions on the part of all world religions and all real ethical systems. If all groups and strata, no matter how diverse they may be, apply these norms in their ideology and their overt actions. If most of their standards and norms contradictory to these supreme norms are eliminated, then humanity will achieve real unity in diversity. Most clashes will be eliminated, and the individual will regain his integrity, happiness, and peace of mind, and kindly and warm-hearted attitude towards his fellow men, the world at large, and God. B. The glorified competition of men and groups. The second general characteristic of our social institutions is represented by egoistic men and groups indefatigably competing with other men and groups for success and superiority in all fields of activity, beginning with the football field and ending with the battlefield. Egoistic competition explicitly lies at the basis of our economic and political institutions. In the opening chapters of our texts in economics and politics, this principle is stressed and overstressed. In thousands of forms, it is daily repeated and glorified. It is declared to represent the very nature of men and groups, constituting the basic motive of all human activities, the source of all inventions and achievements, the driving force of social progress and order. Competition, success, and victory are alleged to be at the heart and soul of our social system. Our paramount ethos centers around them. From the cradle to the grave, everyone is imbued with a sense of the glory of victory over his competitors and opponents, with the fighting spirit, with the cult of power, with the sweet intoxication of prize winning in sports, business, politics, science, religion, ethics, the fine arts, and whatnot. Our heroes and supermen are invariably militant persons who successfully subjugate their rivals in activities ranging all the way from innocent sports to murder and other crime. Our very institutions are, first and foremost, instruments for subduing rivals. By the very nature of this principle, it breeds incessant inter-individual, intergroup, and international conflicts. If egoistic competition in respect to insignificant values does not engender jealousy, enmity, hatred, ruthlessness, and destructive conflicts, competition involving important values generate all such force. Other conditions being equal, the greater the values involved in the competition, the more profound, unquenchable, and destructive the antagonism. As long as selfish competition remains the foundation of our social life, there is little hope of eliminating enmity and grave conflict. Hence the necessity for limiting and supplementing this principle. In the field of ideology, the conception of man as a purely egoistic creature controlled by egoistic motives should be dispelled. There hardly ever existed a purely egoistic person. If human beings have been controlled by the egoistic factor of the struggle for existence, no less have they been motivated by the need for mutual aid and cooperation. The helplessness of a newborn babe and the non-self-sufficiency of man in general have made cooperation, mutual aid, sympathy, and sacrifice an indispensable condition of the survival of the human species. For these reasons alone, altruism is as much a part of man's second nature as egoism. The natural man, as a purely egoistic person, is a fiction invented by modern pseudoscience. It confuses the egoism due to the specific traits of sensate culture with man's inherent nature. So far as such a myth has influenced human beings, justifying their selfish propensities, it has been destructive and antisocial. As an invalid and degrading conception, it should be replaced by a more scientific conception of man as a creature possessing altruistic as well as egoistic propensities. The false glorification of egoistic competition as the dominant motive for industry and creative activities must be replaced by sounder theories, more adequate scientifically and less destructive socially. The discoveries, inventions, and major achievements in religion and ethics, law, philosophy, the fine arts, science, and technology, as well as in practical life, that have enriched human culture have not been due primarily to egoistic motives, that is, considerations of personal advantage. The extreme egoists, the antisocial Scrooges, criminals, and the like, have contributed scarcely anything to the enrichment and ennoblement of human life and culture. They have been parasites, and destroyers rather than creators. On the other hand, almost every important discovery, invention, and creation has been the product of the collective, cooperative effort of many persons and many generations. In the personal motivation of the real builders of human culture, purely egoistic considerations have played a very modest role, often none at all. Creators of notable religious and ethical values have acted contrary to or in disregard of egoistic considerations, most of them deliberatively sacrificing many personal advantages, sometimes even their lives, for the sake of their creative activities. They have acted in the interests of the well-being of humanity, or for the greater glory of God, rather than for the sake of wealth, fame, sensual gratification, and the like. In a slightly less degree, the same is true of the overwhelming majority of all other creators, inventors, and discoverers, eminent scientists, philosophers, lawgivers, artists, and so on. Many of these were so little motivated by egoistic considerations that they did not trouble even to attach their names to their creations or achievements, and hence remained anonymous. Homer and Dante, Bach and Mozart, Michelangelo and Phidias, Plato and Kant, Archimedes and Newton, were motivated primarily by a sense of the needs of their fellow men or by the irresistible elan of their creative genius, divine madness, superconscious inspiration, etc. From the standpoint of the egoistic theory, such creators were guilty of stupidity, for they profited little from their activities in a material or practical sense. Many of them were penniless and died in poverty. They enjoyed few physical comforts, few privileges, scant power, in short, a minimum of sensate values. Many of them suffered persecution for their creative activities. To declare that egoism and egoistic competition are the only source of human progress and culture may suit the interests of unscrupulous exploiters of creative forces, be they slave owners, sterile potentates, destructive politicians, or whatnot. But science is entitled to state the facts as they really are. By dispelling such fictions, science may serve the cause of altruism, goodwill, and creativity, helping to prepare the ground for the cultivation of more cooperative human relationships. Deflated ideologically, egoistic competition must, moreover, actually be reduced in all social institutions and in the relationships of individuals and groups. It is hardly possible to eliminate it entirely from the conduct of the majority of people and from all social groups and institutions, but it should and can be limited, being replaced in part by the opposite principle of non-competitive cooperation and service. The cult of victory and success can be mitigated and partially supplanted by the ethos of humility, love, and sacrifice. That such a limitation and such a replacement are feasible is well attested by the multitude of family groups and groups of true friends, and by the millions of altruistic actions performed daily by even allegedly egoistic men and groups. The relationships between the members of even the average family or group of friends are determined only in part by selfish interests. In their greater part, they consist of non-competitive cooperation, service, and sacrifice inspired by love or sympathy, each member striving to do his best to promote the welfare of the other members, regardless of his own personal advantage. The joys and sorrows of one member are shared by the family as a whole. The achievement of one member becomes the achievement of the rest of the family. Ordinary mothers and fathers gladly sacrifice their time, strength, comfort, and even health and life to help a sick child, and a similar sacrifice is cheerfully made by the children for their parents. In the same way are motivated the relationships between real friends. Less pure but similar is the motive force determining the relationships of the members of many pre-literate tribes, of some pastoral and agricultural peoples, of monastic and religious sects, and even of a regiment on the battlefield, where everyone fights for the other members, and the whole regiment stands behind every soldier, without any meticulous calculation of personal advantages and disadvantages. Non-egoistic motivation is daily advanced by a host of unselfish acts, and when a stranger rushes into a burning house and at the risk of his life attempts to rescue persons unknown to him, or when in a drive for a community fund, people contribute anonymously a large portion of their means for the welfare of others, the existence of such groups, persons, and actions eloquently attests to the possibility of a marked limitation of egoism and selfish competition, of the cult of success and victory, and the feasibility of their partial replacement by non-competitive cooperation, generosity, and willing sacrifice. Moreover, if the organization of a group or institution is deliberatively aimed at a release of altruistic forces, the group morale becomes particularly powerful in propelling its members in the direction of cooperative and unselfish actions. This has been demonstrated by experimental studies of school children undertaken by several investigators, especially by Hartshorn and May, whose works are cited above. A notable reduction of egoism and egoistic competition among groups and individuals is possible without any corresponding reduction of their industry and creativeness. In a number of cases, achievement is actually promoted by a restriction of the fighting spirit and of the cult of success obtained at the cost of the defeat of rivals. For a small fraction of humanity, its foremost creators and altruists, the motive of egoistic competition can be eliminated completely without detriment to their creativity. If geniuses are assured the minimum of subsistence requirements, they will continue to create for the glory of God or the edification of man. The specific forms of the limitation of egoistic competition are many, depending upon conditions, including the nature of the prevailing institutions. Competitive successes are frequently a matter of sheer good luck. It is only reasonable not to credit the full fruits of such luck to the chance victors. Moreover, a considerable proportion of competitive victories in all fields are the result of questionable politics, machinations, favoritism, or outright dishonesty. Such victors are not entitled to their prizes. Most genuine achievements are the result of the collective activity of many known and unknown workers. The credit should be given to the aggregate of the contributors. Scarcely any of the major successes in such fields as business, economics, and politics are actually due to the superhuman efforts of this or that captain of industry and finance, or the leader of this or that political faction. It is only just to assure the highest possible minimum of economic and political values to everyone before gigantic fortunes, conspicuous luxuries, or dictatorial powers are granted to any individual or faction. On the other hand, the burden of sacrifice, suffering, grief, and sorrow is distributed under the egoistic competitive system out of all proportion to the merits or demerits of individuals and groups. The nobler part of humanity is generally allotted a far larger proportion of these burdens than its more callous part. A more equitable distribution is both desirable and possible. The cross of Calvary should be borne not simply by Jesus and a small fraction of humanity, but by everyone. Thus the sufferer would become a member of one suffering collectivity, instead of bearing his bitter cross alone and forsaken. The problem of a more equitable distribution of burdens and sorrows is even more important than that of advantages, privileges, and pleasures. Oneness in sorrow binds human beings by stronger and nobler ties than community of privilege, power, or vice. The limitation and replacement of the egoism and self-centered competition of our institutions along these lines will markedly reduce envy and hatred, wars and other conflicts, engendering a spirit of goodwill among men and mitigating even the sorrows of the innocent victims of misfortune. C. Predominant contractual and compulsory relationships. However diverse, all human relationships can be grouped into three main classes: familistic, contractual, and compulsory. Familistic relationships are permeated by mutual love, devotion, and sacrifice. They are exemplified by the relationships between the members of a devoted family. The ego of a member is there merged into a single we with common values, joys, and sorrows. Help is gladly given and gladly accepted. The group is a solidary entity. Contractual relationships are marked by a voluntary agreement of the parties for their common advantage. Such relations are devoid of love as well as enmity. The parties remain self-centered and seek their own advantage, but through the free exchange of services or values, they reconcile their advantage with that of other parties. Compulsory relations involve coercion of the weaker party by the stronger. Such relationships are inherently inimical and antagonistic. They are the worst form of interpersonal and intergroup relationship, frequently resulting in grave conflicts. The bulk of the interpersonal and intergroup relationships of the Western population of the 19th and early 20th century was made up of contractual fibers. Economic relations between employer and employees, buyer and seller, and producer and consumer in the capitalist economy have been mainly contractual, the parties voluntarily entering into an agreement to exchange wages for services or money for merchandise. In contrast to the economy of slavery or serfdom, coercion has played a minor role. In contradistinction to the familistic economy, labor and capitalists, employer and employees, buyers and sellers have not been perceptibly attached to one another by a sense of love or devotion. They have merely pursued their own interests. Similarly, our political relationships have also been predominantly contractual, with the rights and duties of the government and the citizens freely agreed upon and definitely limited. Similarly, our political relationships have also been predominantly contractual, with the rights and duties of the government and the citizens freely agreed upon and definitely limited. The governments being elected by the citizens, everyone being assured the minimum of his inalienable rights, and the duties of each being clearly defined by covenant. The family and marriage have likewise been contractual, the parties voluntarily entering into the marriage contract. The same applies to religious, scientific, artistic, professional, educational, and other groups and associations. The contractual structure of Western society has thus been fully developed. While less noble than the familistic type of relations, it has been incomparably better than the coercive system of foreign conquerors, autocratic governments, slave owners, and the oppressive nobles of the feudal age. Though contractual relations are implicitly egoistic, each party trying to get as much as possible for as little as possible, nevertheless, so long as the parties entered into the contract voluntarily, so long as they fulfilled their obligations, so long as they did not attempt to use the agreement to the detriment of the other party, their egoistic interests were compatible with the common advantage, their relationships remained free from enmity, and internal and international peace was tolerably well preserved throughout the century from 1815 to 1914. Unfortunately, in the course of their development, these contractual relationships degenerated. Their implicit egoism progressively led to abuse of the contract at the expense of the other parties. The growing relativization of law and moral obligations impaired the binding power of contracts and resulted in ever-increasing violation of their contractual obligations by individuals, groups, and governments. Economic and other conditions, such as depression and unemployment, deprived many parties of contractual freedom on an equal basis and converted many agreements into compulsory contracts made under duress. Finally, as a result of general demoralization, certain parties, such as gangs of criminal racketeers, unscrupulous politicians, and commercial cynics, began to conclude contracts detrimental to the rest of the population. This degeneration of contractual relations naturally resulted in the dislocation and eventual crumbling of the whole contractual structure. The delicately balanced egoistic forces finally lost their equilibrium and exploded in a series of unparalleled conflicts, wars, revolutions, and other intergroup clashes, as well as interpersonal conflicts. Contractual capitalism and democratic governments were swept away. being supplanted partly by paternalistic regimes, but principally by coercive economic regimes and political dictatorships. Contractual freedom of thought, speech, the press, association, religion, and occupation have been steadily replaced by authoritarianism. The contemporary world exhibits a notable decrease of true contractual relationships in interpersonal and intergroup action, a considerable increase of purely compulsory relationships, and a slight accretion of familistic relations. And he references Dynamics 3, chapters 1 through 4, Crisis, chapters 5 through 7, and Society, chapters 29 to 33. It is evident that as long as degenerate contractual relations or compulsory relations persist, there is no hope of lasting internal or international peace. The very nature of pseudo-contractual and compulsory relations generates incessant brutal conflicts. In this texture of our institutions and groups, 1. The compulsory fibers should be reduced to the very minimum. 2. Pseudo-contractual relations formed under duress must be replaced by true contractual ones freely entered into, faithfully sustained by all parties, and not used to the detriment of other parties to the contract, and devoid of prejudice to the public at large. And 3. The familistic relations should be increased as much as possible, extending far beyond one's own family, friends, or faction, potentially over the whole of humanity. How to accomplish this is a technical question to be discussed later. Here it suffices to indicate clearly what should be done with the fibers of our human relationship in order that they may produce peace and harmony instead of enmity and conflict. This chapter has singled out 3 general properties of our social institutions. It has demonstrated that their conflict-breeding functions, and has indicated how to render our institutions peace-generating centers instead of hatred-breeding foci. We are now prepared to undertake a diagnosis of our dominant institutions in order to see what their role is in generating altruistic and egoistic forces.